All right, what is up, A Push peeps? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Happy Monday. I know that I promised you a short video because you have a test that's due on end of the day today, so I will do my best to uphold that end of the bargain. But we are beginning a brand new unit today, so make sure that you pay close attention so that you are as prepared as possible to engage in our studies for this week so that you can start a new unit on the right foot. Additionally, this is not related to the class, but it is related to the class. I'm wearing my voter registration drive shirt today, so I'd appreciate it if you reached out to somebody this week, friend, family member, neighbor, sworn enemy, who is uh, um, maybe not registered to vote, but eligible to vote. Reach out to them, ask them to get registered because we have a very important election coming up in a few short weeks, and every vote matters. And I want to make sure that our voices as a community are heard. So, speaking of elections, we're also going to speak about a very monumental election today, one I've already discussed, but one that serves as the end point for period 3 and the launch point for period 4, because it's a really big turning point. And that's the election of 1800. So, as I told you at the end of period 3, but I'm going to revisit it today because it's that important, this election is a huge turning point because it marks the first time in which power is transferred from one group to another group peacefully. The Federalists lose the election. Adams, after becoming much less popular due to the Alien Sedition Acts, the quasi-war with France, as well as the Federalists' insistence on appealing just to the upper-class elites in society, the Federalists have lost their credibility, have lost their national appeal, and the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson have taken over, and they win the election of 1800. And believe it or not, the Federalists never again hold the presidency and will be dead by 1815. But we'll talk about that this week in our live session. So the map looks like this, right? We still see something of a sectional divide as the Federalists are going to still maintain their control over New England, the northeastern part, as well as some of the Atlantic seaboard, more commerce-driven areas, whereas the Democratic Republicans are going to win the South and the West, which is going to be a growing trend that we'll see at the beginning of period 4. Right? As we move westward onto the frontier, that implies more people are moving, that implies population is spreading, and that implies more everyday kind of people that are spreading out, and thus will support the Democratic Republicans. But Jefferson takes office in 1801, and his inaugural address, right, his first speech to the American people that he gives on the day he's sworn into office as the president. I put a clip of it, a short little chunk of it, in your AMSCO reading handout for this week. But the real theme, the real message of it is that we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. He's going to argue for unity, right, after a very divisive election, and really after a very divisive administration by John Adams, right, an administration that causes political divide, that attempts at times to restrict the freedom of speech with like the Alien Sedition Act, which we talked about. So Jefferson's going to attempt to appeal to the commonality in Americans by arguing that we're all on the same team, we're all on the same page, maybe we should stop fighting with each other over all this petty stuff, and we should all just move the country forward in the right direction. Now, what the right direction is of course what they've been fighting about all this time, but now that Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans are in charge, they're going to try to move the country in a different direction. So that's our big election. Democratic Republicans take office. The tail end of period 4. And just as a reminder, I know this was from last unit as well, but their ideology, the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans, their ideology is really built on states' rights, on our state government having, having more authority, more power over their state than the federal government does. Right? They believe in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which, as you recall, argues that if the Constitution doesn't say the federal government can do whatever that thing is, then they can't do that thing. It's that easy. It's almost like they look at the Constitution as a permission slip for the things the government can do, and if it's not listed, no can do. Right? They believe in stronger local and state governments. They believe in a society and an economy that is dominated by an agricultural world. The yeomanry, the everyday self-sufficient, self-sustaining farmer, is kind of the ideal American in Jefferson's ideology. They are largely represent the rural interests, and they dislike urban cities, which you saw in that clip of Jefferson just 2 weeks ago when discussing banks and finance and things with Hamilton. And they are dominated by small farmers and large farmers alike, as well as the in urban areas, the artisans, the smaller business people that aren't the rich elite commerce-driven businesses that would have supported the Federalists. They're going to be pretty anti-British in their policies and more in line with France, although we're going to have beef with both in this unit. And their geographic base of support is largely in the West, the growing West, which, as we just saw, we've added a couple new states of late, the growing West, as well as in the South, where agriculture is the dominant way of life. So that's their ideology. We're going to check back at the end of our live session today, this week. And I'm going to ask you, like, how much do their actions, once they're in power, how much do their actions actually reflect the ideals that they proclaimed to believe in? So there's 5 real pillars to the Jeffersonian democracy, this era of democracy that's dominated by the Jeffersonians. We'll look at this now. In a couple weeks, we're going to look at some similarities and some slight differences in Jacksonian democracy under Andrew Jackson. So I put on your notes a little table for you to fill out the key ideas as I go through these. But the 5 pillars, the five main ideological claims of Jefferson and his supporters are as follows. First, they see themselves as the preservers or the savers, if you will, of American republicanism. They argue that the Federalists did not represent the will of the people and thus violated the Republican ideals the country is founded on of representative government. If you're not representing the people, then you're not following representative government. And to do so, they're going to emphasize civic virtue, that the everyday people, individuals themselves, can make good decisions, can elect good leaders, can exert their own influence, and do the right thing for the country as a whole. You're going to read about in your extension activity this week about some of the aristocratic traditions that Washington and Adams put in place that Jefferson's going to get rid of. Because they're going to believe in republicanism and representative rule, they're going to heavily emphasize the need for education, right? Because if we're going to have everyday people influencing our country, we want those everyday people to be smart and know what the heck they're talking about. Second pillar is the belief in an agrarian society, a society built on agriculture. That's what agrarian means. With the yeomanry, this class of everyday small farmers that is self-sufficient as the ideal citizens. They like the idea that the yeomanry, the everyday farmers, don't have to rely on government assistance or banks or loans or interest. They just can farm their stuff, trade their stuff, and mind their own business. Their argument against industrialization and against urban type of economy is that wage and factory workers are too dependent on a boss, are too dependent on who's above them, and it creates like a working class and a managerial class and an ownership class, and it might lead to class conflicts. If everybody was just a self-sufficient farmer, there would be no class conflict because everybody's just doing their own thing. I would argue that actually runs against what's actually happening on farms, which is the big rich plantation owners have all the good land and nobody else does. But hey, class conflict is everywhere. And Jefferson and his supporters will argue that cities are cesspools of corruption, which again is a line that you saw in the John Adams miniseries clip that I showed you on Hamilton and Jefferson, and that cities are full of industrialists and bankers, and the real Americans are the ones living on farms and doing their own thing. They believe in a very limited federal government, which I've already discussed, with a strict interpretation. However, the powers that do live in the national government, they think should reside in the legislative branch. That of the 3 branches, the legislative branch should exert more influence because the legislative branch is where you see the will of the people, right? So this kind of lines up with their ideology that we've already discussed. They don't like the national government being in any sort of debt, and they don't like any influence being exerted by the judiciary, the judicial branch, because again, their argument is that the judiciary is appointed. Presidents appoint judges; they pick judges to be confirmed or to be approved by the Senate. So again, their argument against the judiciary exerting any influence is that they don't reflect the will of the people. Right? So their big belief is that the will of the people, American republicanism. In terms of foreign policy, Jefferson's going to champion the idea of an empire of liberty, meaning America is going to create an empire, but it's not going to be like a British empire. It's going to be an empire of liberty, where we're spreading out to spread American ideals and values and democracy, as opposed to spreading out, in his mind, to create colonies. Their argument is that standing armies, having an army present in life is dangerous and should be avoided, which is one of the reasons why we see Jefferson, for example, hating the Whiskey Rebellion response, because the idea of an army that could oppress their own people is worrisome. And much like Washington, actually, this is a commonality. The Jeffersonians are going to want to avoid alliances and this is a new piece, try to limit international trade so the U.S. can mind its own business here in the Western Hemisphere. That's why I put a very Western-focused foreign policy. From a social cultural standpoint, they're going to believe in the common man as long as that common man is white and on a farm. They believe strongly in the separation of church and state, which is one of the reasons why Jefferson is famous for writing the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which is one of the first documents that actually separates church and state. They believe in women being educated and having a role in the home, but under the ideals of Republican motherhood. Right? Republican, Democratic republics, Republican, American republicanism is a theme here. Republican motherhood, but women should be absent from direct politics, should not have a say. That's the man's job. On the issue of Native Americans, Jefferson even characterized natives as noble savages, right? So kind of a catch-22 there, who believed they could be Americanized into a yeoman class of their own. They could become like a Native American yeomanry, but that white people and Native Americans don't coexist together. So the Native Americans should be pushed off out to the frontier where they can develop American ideals, but not intermingle with white America. And of course, based on their support in the West and the South, and just in America in general, we're going to see them espousing the ideas of common white male supremacy and supportive of the idea of slavery. So those are the pillars of Jeffersonian democracy. Let's talk about Jefferson as president. And today we're going to talk about his first term, his first 4 years as president. I'll save the rest for our live session. So he enters office with a pretty clear ideology that we just talked about, right? And then he's got goals to back that ideology. He's got some actions he's going to take that are going to be right in line with the ideology that he proclaims to believe in. First, to reduce the size of the government. He thinks the government's gotten too big, and thus the government's got too expensive. And now the government's responding to people with money instead of the everyday people. So we're going to get a smaller government, reduce those tariffs, reduce those taxes, reduce the government involved in this, or the bank and that. And therefore will promote Republican agrarianism. So everyday farmers can have their say because the government will reflect the will of the people by being small and cheap and effective and efficient. That's goal one. Goal two, to get rid of those Federalist policies that he sees as unconstitutional, specifically the Alien and Sedition Acts, which you may recall, Jefferson actually writes the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions trying to nullify those acts with Madison, who will be our next president. So to get rid of those policies they see as against American ideals. And at the very end of Adams' presidency, the Federalists look at the world and they realize, damn, we just lost the presidency, we just lost power in the legislative branch. The Federalists look at this and like, we just lost all of our authority and our power. One thing they do that's going to be pretty consequential is they pass a new Judiciary Act of 1801, so right before Jefferson takes office. Because he's, of course, elected in 1800, takes office the following year after what's called the lame duck period in between. The Federalists are going to pass a new Judiciary Act, which creates a bunch of new judge positions in the federal courts. We talked about the Judiciary Act of 1789 last unit. So a bunch of new judge positions. And if you remember from last unit, these federal judges, when they get appointed, they're there in that job until they die or they retire. So these judges are going to be in their judicial authority for a long, long time. And Adams, on his way out, is going to fill all those positions with Federalists, right? Because they're looking at it like, man, we lost the presidency, we lost the legislative branch, we're losing power, we're losing legitimacy. The country doesn't like us very much. We're spreading out westward. More immigrants are coming. They're going to support Democratic Republicans. This is not good for the Federalist legacy. Ooh, but we can at least maintain our control over the judicial branch by appointing a bunch of new judges that will serve for life. And that's pretty much exactly what happens. So these become known as John Adams' midnight judges or midnight appointments because their argument is that it happens like on midnight, the day before Adams is out of office. So Jefferson wants to find a way to get rid of these guys. He fails in that one. And Jefferson wants to continue the international peace that was proctored by Washington and Adams. However, like any good leader, Jefferson's going to have to compromise many of his ideological principles, his values, to be effective for what the country needs at a time. So let's talk about some things he does that backs his ideology. He wants to reverse Federalist policies. He wants to reduce the size, reduce the cost of the national government. So to do so, he cuts the size of the army. He doesn't like standing armies, so he makes the army really, really small. That saves money. Cool, we don't got to pay those soldiers anymore. Done. Saved us some money. Check us out. He eliminates the whiskey tax. He eliminates the slave tax. He eliminates any property taxes, so he cuts taxes. which is, of course, going to reduce the income of the government, but also now the government's not having to enforce these taxes and to pay tax collectors to go collect this money and cause tension, right? We know the Jeffersonians hate taxes anyway. He's going to allow the charter of the Bank of the U.S. to expire, it was a 20-year term. The bank comes up for renewal in 1808 at the end of Jefferson's presidency, and he's going to just let it expire, and we're not going to have a national bank for the next 10 or so years. That cuts some of the cost and the size and the power of the federal government. And he takes the revenue that's coming as America's economy is growing, and therefore we're getting to be a more successful country economically. The tariffs that Hamilton put in place that are charged on imports from other countries as America is trading more and engaging in more commerce. He's going to use all that tariff income as the country gets more economically successful to pay down the federal government's debt. All right, the big goal here is to reduce the size of the national government, as you see there, and to restore this power back to the state governments where Jefferson thinks it belongs. Now, one thing that's really consequential at the beginning of his presidency is the Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison. Arguably the most important Supreme Court case in U.S. history because it's going to establish the ability of the court to do what it's done ever since. Now, the case itself is confusing, and I'm not going to spend any time on it here with you today. We'll talk a little bit about it in the live session, and you'll read a little bit about it in your extension activity. But it deals with those midnight judges that we talked about just a minute ago. Jefferson argues that these judges should not be seated, that it was unconstitutional of Congress to create all these new judge positions on their way out of power. And the new Supreme Court Chief Justice, the guy in charge, he's been in charge for a long, long time. We're going to keep his name around for a hot minute. John Marshall. He's going to rule in this case in a pretty complicated ruling that what Congress did in 1789 with the first Judiciary Act was unconstitutional, and thus the one judge here, Marbury, who we're dealing with, should not be given the seat on the court because it violated the Constitution. Now, this doesn't sound that exciting. It's not that exciting. But what this does is this establishes the principle of judicial review, which is a very complicated term that I'll simplify as much as possible. Judges checking, right? Judicial, judges review to check to see what's going on. And judicial review is going to be the solution the court creates to decide who is going to decide if a law or an action by the government is constitutional, is legal, it's allowed. John Marshall, as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, says it is emphatically the province or the power and the duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. So this principle of judicial review is really important because the court's going to use it for the next 220 years to say sometimes like, nope, Congress, you can't do that, that's unconstitutional. Or nope, President, you can't do that, that's unconstitutional. So in a sense, this is going to set up the judicial branch as a third co-equal branch of government that has this power to check the legislative and the executive branch. Now, Jefferson's going to disagree with this because judicial review argues that the courts have the final say on what's constitutional, whereas Jefferson in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions argued that the states themselves could nullify laws they didn't see constitutional. So this shouldn't surprise us as a conflict because John Marshall, appointed by John Adams, is going to have a federalist ideology. And here we have the national government having more power to decide what laws are allowed and not, whereas Jefferson, as a Democratic Republican, prefers states' rights. So here we are again with that same issue. But the principle of judicial review will remain, will stay, and is still used by the courts today to rule on whether or not things are constitutional and allowed. So John Marshall is going to serve for the next 35 years as Supreme Court Chief Justice, which is going to be really monumental for us because it's going to keep a federalist ideology alive in the judicial branch, even though the Federalist Party will be long since dead by then. So it's going to keep the ideology that the federal government should have supremacy over the states in their court rulings for the next 35 years, and that's going to be really important, and we're going to reference a lot of these cases as we go. We talk about economic advances and Indian removal and the like. So important stuff. Now, the last issue I'm going to talk about today is the Louisiana Purchase. Now, throughout Jefferson's presidency, the U.S. population is growing quite rapidly, from both immigration and from an increase in birth rates as the country is getting more stable. That means people are more comfortable having more children. And we see this 10-year window from 1800 to 1810, so that the 8 years of Jefferson's presidency and then the first 2 of Madison's, this window right in here, the U.S. grows by 2 million people. Now, that's a lot of people to grow in 10 years for a not very big country. And we see it on this map. Right? The lightest color here on the Atlantic seaboard are areas that are settled and settled in by 1800 when Jefferson is elected. Right? Kentucky, and most of the Atlantic seaboard states. By 1810, we see a bunch more settlements spreading out. And by 1820, it's even more. Right? And all this territory is spreading out into the west. Now remember, down here, right, below the Ohio River, slavery is allowed. Up here, north of the Ohio River, slavery is not allowed. Thanks, Articles of Confederation, for your one lasting contribution to our nation with the Northwest Ordinance. Nice. Glad you guys remembered that. Now, we see a couple new states. Kentucky becomes a state in 1792. Tennessee in 1796. So there's Kentucky. There's Tennessee. Ohio becomes a state right there in 1803. So we got 3 new states into the Union, which demonstrates again that our population is spreading out. And remember, thanks to the land ordinance under the Articles of Confederation, these states get to come in as co-equal states, right? They get their 2 senators like everybody else. They get their representatives in the House of Representatives based on population like everybody else, okay? But Jefferson's worried that as we spread out, we're going to have all these people out here without any access to the Mississippi River and the Port of New Orleans. So how are all these yeoman farmers, these everyday farmer peeps, going to get their goods out to trade? How are we going to spread this empire of liberty if we can't even access the most important port here? Now, you should be asking yourself, wait a second, Winch. Pretty sure Pinckney's Treaty was from Spain, and it gave the U.S. access to the Port of New Orleans and the Mississippi River. You'd be correct. Except, in the meantime, Spain sold this territory to France, and France doesn't want to let us use this because France is still salty at us for the quasi-war and everything else. So, fair. Jefferson's solution is to try to buy the Port of New Orleans, right? He just wants to buy New Orleans so the U.S. can use the Mississippi River to facilitate trade and commerce. So Jefferson sends a group to France to try to buy just New Orleans, this little city at the end of the Mississippi River where the river flows out into the ocean so that all those people spreading out west can get their goods in and out. Now, Napoleon by now is broke. Napoleon is broke. He's fighting everybody in Europe. He's going all wild, invading Russia, fighting England. It's a hot mess. Prussia, Sweden, Austria. It's getting crazy. Napoleon's broke. So he's like, you know what? I got a deal for you. You offered me $10 million for New Orleans. What if you give me $15 million and I give you the entire Louisiana territory? Jefferson's like, well, yeah, that seems like a pretty good deal. Look at this. We're gonna have all this new land. We're gonna double the size of the U.S. with just $15 million. That's a freaking steal. You can go to Beverly Hills now and buy one house for $15 million. We're gonna double the size of the whole country for that much money. Great idea. Except wait. The Constitution does not say that I can buy land as the president, nor does it say that Congress has the ability to buy land, so I can't buy this land because I believe in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. But that's my political ideology. My economic ideology says that we have to have more yeoman farmers. Where are all these farmers going to go? We need more land. If we don't have enough land, we're going to end up industrializing. Right? If you can't farm, you got to do something else. Too much crowding, that creates cities. So Jefferson is torn between his political ideology, which says he can't do this because it's not in the Constitution, and his economic ideology, which says he needs to do this to keep encouraging westward expansion, an empire of liberty, and a yeoman-based economy. He ends up siding with his economic ideology, says this is good for the country, it's good for the future of the country that I prefer. Congress agrees. They approve the purchase of Louisiana from the French for $15 million. And just like that, the size of the country is doubled. The size of the country is doubled. Now, if you remember, however, when England's country got larger because of the Treaty of Paris 1763, that also caused problems. So just because you have more land, now you have to govern more land. You have to manage more land. You have to create order and stability in more land. So Americans are excited about these new Western lands, but there are some problems that are presented. First, was it constitutional? Was it allowed? And here we are. Jefferson, The strict interpretationist using the elastic clause to say it's necessary and proper for the country, so we're going to justify it anyway. To which the Federalists are like, where the hell was that perspective when you were railing against everything that we did for freaking 12 years, you hypocrite? Second, what about all those French people and the Spanish people that live in New Orleans and elsewhere in this territory? Right? Jefferson, despite his belief in protecting liberty for all, spreading this empire of liberty, refuses to grant citizenship to those foreigners that were there. So we buy the land that they live on and do not make them citizens. So, some controversies. And of course, the Federalists are pissed. They're going to say, wait a second, we believe, all of a sudden, now that we're not in power anymore, we believe in a strict interpretation. The Constitution does not say that Jefferson can do this, therefore he cannot. Which is hilarious because for 12 years of their administrations, they used the loose interpretation of the elastic clause to make a bank, to put a tariff, all sorts of things. I'm going to say the president doesn't have the power to purchase Louisiana. And their argument is that it would cost too much and it would put the U.S. in more debt, which is ironic because if we rewind a couple of years, Hamilton is arguing that debt is a good thing and it creates more economic stability. So here the Federalists are, in a sense, telling on themselves that their ideology was really rooted in power, not in any real principles. The real reason the Federalists are upset is go all the way back to the election of 1800 or 1796. All the western new states are voting Democratic-Republican. The Federalists are still confined in the New England area, in the Northeast, where commerce and education and business is located. So if we buy all this land and all these people spread out, that's just going to create more area for Democratic-Republicans to create new states that are in favor of Democratic-Republicans. And the Federalists see this as like the end of their chance to create power because their geographic base of support is so limited. So the real concern has nothing to do with the debt, nothing to do with the constitutional interpretation of the principle. It has everything to do with the fear that this new territory will be loyal to Democratic Republicans. So some effects that are worth noting. Short term, it creates a constitutional crisis that is resolved when Jefferson just decides to violate his ideology and do it anyway. We have very, very weak control over this new land, which leads to the Aaron Burr conspiracy, which you read about this week as well. Again, just because you have new land doesn't mean that land is manageable. Long term is really important, though, right? Because it creates the precedent that any time we create new expansion of land, that land will, again, just like the Northwest Ordinances did, that land will become equal states, not colonies, not like an empire in which we're having territories overseas that are only existing for the U.S. benefit. That'll come later. It's going to increase security because it gets one more European power out of our way that can cause conflict in the near future. And it's going to really facilitate westward expansion and what later becomes known as the ideals of manifest destiny, that Americans are destined to conquer this entire continent, to spread their ideals, their perspectives, their beliefs, which will be a real big thing by the end of period 4 and also in period 5. This also, of course, will impact tensions with the Native Americans, who are like, again, the white people have bought our land without asking if we wanted them to live here. Americans are going to strongly reject coexistence with Indians, whereas the French are fine with coexistence. And some Native American leaders like Tecumseh is going to work to try to create coalitions of tribes to stop selling land to the white people and to avoid any attempts to interact or trade with white people because he says it always ends badly for the Native Americans. He's right. But Jefferson instead prefers his view that these Native Americans could be civilized into their own yeoman farmer class. And in his vision, he's going to have this beautiful reservation for Native Americans to go be civilized west of the Mississippi River, which actually won't really happen until the Jackson presidency. So Jefferson's incredibly, incredibly popular. Look at this election. He runs for re-election in 1804. As you see, the Democratic Republicans enjoy enormous support from a very successful first term of his presidency. Our boy Charles Pinckney, he of the Pinckney Treaty, is going to run as the Federalist and not do so well. But Jefferson's second term is plagued by problems, largely with foreign policy, much like Adams was. But I'm going to leave it there for now, and I will see you in class this week. Have a great day.